Today, on Writers on the Road, we're visiting author Eva Crocker at one of her favorite places, her Aunt Wanda's house in Broad Cove. Every year at Writers at Woody Point, we invite authors from around the world to our small town in Newfoundland to tell their stories in our favorite place. Now, we're hitting the road to visit some of our favorites in places that are special to them. I'm Stephen Brunt, and this is Writers on the Road. Eva Crocker first joined us at Writers at Woody Point in 2021 to read from her first novel, All I Ask. She's also the author of the novel Back in the Land of the Living and the short story collection Barreling Forward. And she has a new novel on the way. She's one of the most exciting young writers to come out of the province and immediately established her own strong and distinctive voice. Originally from the provincial capital of St. John's, she splits time between Newfoundland and Montreal. I met with Eva at her Aunt Wanda's house in Broad Cove, a quiet community and a hub for rural LGBTQ+ celebrations. Wanda's shed is the stuff of dreams. Old signage and curios fill the walls, and a ton of mismatched wooden chairs sit waiting for folks to hang out and enjoy some music together in the evenings. Eva, it's great to see you.
You too.
Yeah, it's been a while, and thanks for bringing us here. As well, this amazing shed, like the shed of everyone's dreams here. So that number one. Outside is pretty nice here too. But tell us, we've asked everybody in this series where they wanted to have this conversation, and you chose to have it here. I kind of think of you as somebody from town, but why did you want to? Tell us about this place and why you wanted to do it here.
This was the first place that came to mind, this shed, because it's my Aunt Wanda's shed. And she's had this house for, I think, 34 years or something. Just shortly after I was born, she bought this house, and I spent a lot of time with her out here as a kid. And in this shed specifically, like, she used to have a old broken down Volkswagen Bug in here, and I loved to just like sit in the car and play with the steering wheel and that kind of thing. But since then, more of my family has moved out here, so my dad lives out here full-time, and I have aunts as well, other aunts. So I'm doing school in Montreal, but when I come back to Newfoundland for the past 6 years or so, it's usually to this community, to Broad Cove, and I think of this as my home out here. You know, I love St. John's, and I always make a point to get in and see friends and the cultural stuff going on, but I kind of think of this as home now. I think because Wanda moved out here, there are many lesbians living on the shore, which is a really cool and particular thing about this spot.
That's very cool. Oh, that's great. And we met Wanda just a few minutes ago, and I want to do another one of these with her, by the way.
She's pretty incredible.
She is pretty. I could tell. That came through loud and clear. Some of the folks we've talked to in this kind of talk about what they drew from as readers. For them, some of them, again, they generationally, they didn't really have kind of. They didn't feel like there was a Newfoundland literature from which to draw, right? Mm-hmm. That they were kind of the beginning of it in some ways, or that what had existed before was, they couldn't completely relate to what had gone before. Again, I think you're in a different space but when you kind of think about who you read and what you read, as you entered onto that path, what would be the kind of the signpost for you in terms of as a reader?
I think when I was first starting to write, like, the stories that became my first book, Barreling Forward, I was actually reading a lot of American stuff, like all the kind of McSweeney's crowd. But at the same time, I took some classes with Larry Matthews at MUN, and he talks a lot about writing what you know and writing Newfoundland and put the actual street name in, and all of that was very influential to me and thinking about, like, is it possible to write, what now feels to me like a really American kind of short story, but with this as the subject matter and the setting and that kind of thing.
It's interesting you talk about the short story collection, the first one, because those stories are all, except for one, I think they're all here, right? Every one. There's one, and even the Montreal story has it's connected back, right, at both ends. And so it's very specific in terms of those, and maybe we're talking about with that idea of being specific about the place. Mm-hmm. There's stories that are mostly set in town in St. John's, but they're not stories about St. John's.
I think there's some themes for sure that are about like coming of age, gender, sexuality, power relations in the workplace that feel like could be set in a huge number of places. But then I do think that there's something that's a little bit that moment in Newfoundland and how the kind of like socioeconomic reality of that moment influences those relationships, and puts a certain weight on, say, your relationship with your boss or whatever, And those are kind of like mid 2010s, I would say, that those stories are mostly, that's the moment they're drawing on, kind of.
You're the only queer writer that we've spoken to in this series. And that puts you in a different place again in terms of kind of, people who you might have read, might have influenced you. Mm-hmm. How does that place you differently, do you think?
I mean, I can think of, Susie Taylor, who's got a new book out.
She was just in Woody Point.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a great book.
I love her work. And we had a writing group together when I was writing All I Ask, my first novel that came after the short stories. And she is a great mentor to me. Xavier Michael Campbell is a friend. I love his writing. And again, we have like shared stuff in the past and kind of talked about how to write about sexuality as a queer person specifically. And because I think that people respond to, or I've had the experience of people reading queer sex as much more vulgar and much more explicit than they might a straight sex scene. So do you hold back? Is it important to be specific because it's not represented as much, and even in a kind of like technical, these are the ways we have sex for other queer people, those are some of the conversations that I've had with him. I hope he wouldn't mind me saying. Yeah.
What is the difference for you as a writer between writing a short story? And I was talking about this driving up today. Your short stories, and a lot of like a short story can be unresolved. It can end. It's like in music you would have a 12-bar chorus and it's the 9th bar and you're waiting for it to resolve, or your ear thinks it's going to resolve but it doesn't. Mm-hmm. It can hang in space. Whereas a novel has a different kind of resolution to it, I think. By necessity, but and by approach, when you approach a story and decide how to tell it, how do those two things differ for you?
I've been thinking about that a lot recently because I'm working on short stories right now and I'm really enjoying it. And the novels are like a particular kind of challenge that certainly there was enjoyable things about it, but I really love short stories and I love how there's a kind of, you can focus on a smaller moment and all the sort of nuances of that moment, whereas a novel, to me, it's a collection of these small conflicts, but you have to create enough of a world that everything adds up and all the logistical problems are solved and the timeline works out. In a story, it's like super condensed and intense, and we're really diving into this one moment.
Because you have to, even if it's 6 pages long, you have to believe in the world, and you have to enter the world, and you have to believe in the people, and then you can be left kind of hanging in space. I feel that way at some of the end of your stories, and it's an interesting feeling because you're trying to complete the picture yourself, and trying to and kind of wondering what's the 7th page or what's the 20th page, where does this go, what happened to these people. It's a good feeling, but it's a really distinct feeling.
Some people really don't like it.
Is that right? They want it to end, right? They want to know what happened, right?
And I kind of feel that, even that I feel about novels too, that there should be some openness, because in life things are not resolved and we never get the definitively right answer, and there is no kind of perfect tied up with a bow ending in life, I think. So I want my writing to reflect that.
There is this kind of, for some people, the natural, they start out writing short stories and then now we're going to write the novel, and that's a different thing. It's like the short stories are a practice round for the novel to come. I think they're so different as miniatures that I think they exist in a completely different space.
Mm-hmm. I think the challenge of the short story collection, if the challenge of the novel is kind of like sustaining it and creating a big enough world that's like technically everything adds up and obviously you can play with that, but it has to be true to the rules of the story. In the short story, you can have this really intense moment that you're sitting in, but all the stories in the collection have to be distinct, and those worlds have to be very different, and the characters have to be different, and you have to have like 16 of them or whatever, where it's different in the way of the novel is like sinking in and building out.
Was it the idea of writing the novel? Was that daunting at all then?
For sure. And I was working with Melanie Little, who's edited all my books so far, and I really love her. And I wrote her and I was like, okay, I have like about half the word count and I have all these scenes and I don't know, like, what do I do now? And she was like, well, you have to connect them. You have to like put them on a clothesline in your head and think about how do we make this one continuous thing? And I was like, oh, right.
That's a great explanation. I like that explanation. Yeah. That's a good editor, by the way.
She's so great. She's amazing.
Did you have the whole story in your head before you started?
Yeah, I guess so All I Ask is about this incident that really happened to me, which was that the police like barged into my apartment while I was there alone and accused me of transmitting child pornography, which was due to some sort of like mix up on their end that was never really explained to me. I filed a complaint and nothing really came of it. So I knew I wanted it to be about that and about the feeling of discomfort of having them rifling through the character's computer and how much of yourself is in this digital mirror image and what does it mean to have like authorities have access to that and the kind of journey that character goes on, as well as like coming of age, queer love story, this kind of thing. So I knew those were like the big arcs, and I had all these images and moments, but I guess I wasn't thinking of it all as coherent.
No, but but you had a lot, is what it sounds like, right? And you had that kind of core, obviously. Mm-hmm. What was it like? Kind of mining your own experience and then transforming that into fiction.
Yes, so that sort of inciting incident is real life. I mean, there's fictionalized things about it. I have to say that. But it is pretty true to life. And then what happens beyond that is fiction. A lot of it is made up and invented sort of exploration of how this character would have experienced it. Yeah.
So it acts as a launching point, obviously, for the fiction. But I say drawing on the personal, but then turning it into something larger and outside yourself, which is, I guess, what writers do. Most of the time, you write about and what you know and what you experience. You could have also written it journalistically, though. You could have written it as nonfiction. You could have done a bunch of different ways. Is that the natural impulse for you to make it fiction?
I tried to write it in the third person because that's where I feel most comfortable in my fiction, and I like the kind of distance that it creates a little bit, this feeling to me of the narrator feeling a little separate from what's unfolding. But I just couldn't make it work in the third person, and so I had to switch back to first, even though that felt a little more uncomfortable for me. And I don't know if it was something about that particular incident. I wrote a complaint, so I had recorded pretty soon after exactly what happened. And I was working from that a little bit. So yeah, I don't know. It was a kind of strange writing experience for me. Yeah.
Could you read a bit from the novel?
Sure. Well, this is a different novel.
We're going to read from this. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. This is yes. Let's do that.
So this book is set in Montreal mostly, but it's also about a character from Newfoundland. And it's a little bit about kind of this character has just left and is feeling lonely and excited about this new city. at the same time, this swirl of emotions. So this is a moment where she's kind of imagining what might her friends be doing at home while she's in the big scary city. She thought about what people might be doing at home. It was an hour and a half later and a weeknight, so maybe nothing. Probably the staff at Destruction were closing up for the night. That made her feel a bit better. She pictured walking through the Battery, the brine in the air, cleaning out her sinuses and curling her hair. She tried to remember each house and pothole. The silver mailbox that was actually a tampon disposal receptacle from a public bathroom someone had screwed into their doorframe. The one lawn that was crowded with plywood cutouts painted like Disney characters from the 90s. The narrow cement stairs enshrouded in Mile a Minute that led past the house where Linda had lived with Scott O'Neill for a summer. Marcy fought the urge to dig under the pillow for her phone, to write Linda or Brittany. She had decided it would be easier to never speak to any of them again. Instead, she pictured the outcropping of navy blue rock where 3 or 4 cormorants gathered every day looking out at the Narrows. She thought about the cracked open sea urchin shells that littered the grass along the path. Birds picked the urchins out of the ocean, flew up high, and dropped them so the shells split and the birds could peck at the jelly inside. The sun dried the shells until the prickly spines fell off and you could take them home and use them to decorate your windowsill. Marcy tried to focus on the sound of cars passing through the intersection outside. The building noise of a car approaching and the decrescendo of it carrying on into the night sounded sort of like waves crashing on the beach and sucking back out into the bay. She pulled the blankets over her head to block out the light.
Thank you. That's a great passage. It's beautiful.
Thanks.
I want to ask you about Montreal a little bit, because Montreal is there and in other places in your work, obviously, is your other home. What does Newfoundland look like from there?
It's funny because in this book, I feel like the character is really sort of, missing home in these acute ways, but also feeling this excitement of being in a new place. It's funny, I know a lot of Newfoundlanders in Montreal, and everybody feels strongly about home, and they're like, it's significant to learn that this person is also from Newfoundland. And I think people go through these waves of like, I have to move back. I'm definitely moving back, and I'm so glad to be here, and I don't want to leave. And it's always this back and forth inside.
The push-pull, right?
Yeah.
Again, Newfoundlanders have this such a profound sense of home, and and pining for home, or having to leave home and then seeing home from a distance, and some people not coming out. I run into people who left 40 years ago and they still, then they come back from 40 years in Alberta, and we had to move home. We had to be back. And that's kind of, but I'm not talking about it really in that in the sentimental sense, it's just
right.
I guess kind of anytime any of us leave home, we see our home. You see our home through different people's eyes too. I remember having to tell people where I came from, and when it's one of you self-mythologize, right? You start to describe tell your own story, and I wonder about that, going to be in a place you would run into Newfoundlanders, because God knows you run into Newfoundlanders pretty much everywhere.
Yeah.
But if you ran into somebody from Montreal in your new community and they said, "Where are you from?"
Right. Yes, I'm often describing Newfoundland, and I think it has made me appreciate Newfoundland even more. And a lot of my research is about Newfoundland and Newfoundland visual art from Newfoundland, and so I have been reading a lot about the history of Newfoundland, and I'm like so immersed in it while I'm in this other place. So I do find myself often like longing for it, and it's also an interesting experience. Like my academic research is about Newfoundland, and I'm writing this short story collection about Newfoundland in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I'm reading a lot about the place, and I'm having this experience of being like, this is what I remember unfolding, but I was a child, so I have to go back and check kind of stories about for example, Cabot 500. I've been reading all kinds of stories about that and about the celebrations when Hibernia was dragged out to sea across the island. And I'm having this experience of like, this is what I think is true, but that seems so outrageous. Can it really be the case? And then I go and find the news stories and it's true. And I'm like excited again to tell everybody about Newfoundland and all the things that I have been learning. So I'm falling like more deeply in love with it, and in this specific way that I think is only possible when you're like not there. So these stories are all kind of set during the oil boom and bust, beginning late 90s, ending around 2010s kind of. And they're from lots of different characters' perspectives, and just sort of trying to capture that moment and think about how people were impacted by this glut of money coming in and then disappearing, and how that impacted the place in unexpected ways. So my academic research is about petrocultures and the ways that oil influences society in kind of unexpected ways, on the interpersonal level, on the way that cities are planned, all these sort of not obvious kind of connections to how the oil industry shapes a place. So that is kind of bleeding into my fiction. I'm trying
That's
to
really,
work
that is fascinating. So the convergence of your two different, you know, your academic life and your writerly life. Thanks for doing this today.
Thank you.
Thanks for bringing us to Aunt Wanda's place here.
Yes.
It's been a great experience. It's good seeing you again, and I'm a huge admirer of your work. So
Oh, thank you.
This has been great.
Thank you so much.